Every now and then you hear the story of the pioneers who put themselves through hardships, and they endured cold winters, and they endured fighting Indians, and the loss of their children to diseases and things. And you just can't imagine and fathom the hardships that they went through. Well, today I'm going to tell you the story of one such woman. Her name was Catherine Gouger Goodman. Born in 1732 in New Jersey, Catherine Gouger and her family moved to Berks County, Pennsylvania in the 1740s, somewhere around 1742. They were on what is now, what was then considered the western frontier. The Shawnee Indians was making forays into Pennsylvania to help drive out the settlers from that area. The French didn't want the white English to be coming into Ohio and any farther west, and the Indians didn't want to lose any of their lands either. And on one such foray there in 1744, the Shawnee Indian attacked the home of the Gouger family. And the story goes that Catherine, who was about 12 years old at the time, was at the cabin with two of her brothers. One of them was, a bit younger than her. The other one was only about 4 years old. And when the Indians attacked the cabin, she sent the oldest brother out to the field to warn her dad and her older brother, who were out working the fields. And her and the young boy were left there alone in the cabin as the Indians attacked. They took her and her young brother, and they left the area, and Catherine had no idea what had happened to the rest of her family. And she, in the ensuing trip, they came towards Ohio, and as they crossed into Ohio, or about 3 days into the trip, her younger brother, her little brother, he couldn't keep up with the Indians. They wouldn't let him ride. They wouldn't let him, anybody carry him. He had to walk, and he couldn't keep up. And so the story is told that he kept falling farther and farther behind. And so there was a brave or two had hung back with him to stay with him while the rest of the group went on. And so into the trip on the third day, as they got into where they made their camp, they got into the camp and they made their camp, and later that evening the other brave, or the other two braves, came back into camp, and they were by themselves. The little boy was not with them, and Catherine noticed that on the belt of one of the Indian braves was a fresh scalp that was obviously the locks of hair from her younger brother, and they had killed him and left him. And so as time went on, they come on into Ohio, and I'm sure the trip was pretty arduous, and they got to their main camp in Ohio, and they were there, and over a period of 5 years, Catherine lived with the Shawnee Indians. And just like any other white settler, white captive, Catherine was made to work and do heavy chores, and she had to be able to defend herself from the other Indian kids and the Indian women, and she proved that she was capable of doing that. And so over a period of time, she gained respect, and they allowed her to build her own wouldn't be called a cabin, but it was a log hut or a brush hut, And she built that, and that's where she lived for a total of 5 years. After about 5 years living with the Shawnee Indians, some French-Canadian trappers came along, and Catherine talked them into purchasing her away from the Shawnee Indians. So they did that, and they took her to Canada. Well, she went to Canada, and they made her basically work off the fees that they paid to buy her. And so she was there for about 2 years when a group of trappers and traders from Pennsylvania showed up. And she told them who she was. And so the French Canadians let her go with the Pennsylvania trappers, and they took her back home. When Catherine got home, she found out that her dad and her 2 brothers had died that day out in the field. The Shawnee Indians had killed them. Her mother and her sister had been down at the spring getting water, and they'd escaped capture. However, by the time the 7 years had passed before she made it back home, both her mother and her sister had died of some other natural cause. And so she was left all alone. By this time, she would have been a 19-year-old young lady, and she was homeless. So one of the neighbors took her in, and then somewhere around 1756, she met a man named George Goodman, and she got married. Over the next 40 years or so, Catherine lived a pretty good life. She had a family and several children, and by 1795, her husband had died. George Goodman had died. And her son, John, had a family, and so she was living with her son, John. Well, John decided that he wanted to come to Ohio and purchase property. Congress at that time was selling land in and around Chillicothe, which is Ross County, Ohio. And so John came to Chillicothe, and he found a piece of land that was still available, and he purchased it. And it was about 200 acres on his original purchase, and he purchased this 200 acres of land. And he had a servant with him that he left here. They built a log cabin, and he left his servant, and he went back to Pennsylvania, got his family, and his mother came with him. When they came here and they got here, they from the account that I read, is they traveled down the Ohio River. They got to somewhere around a port on the Ohio River, probably Gallipolis, more than likely, maybe Portsmouth. And but I don't know that Portsmouth was established yet, but Gallipolis was. And so they made their way from the Ohio River to Ross County, Ohio. And John took his wife, his kids, and his mother to the farm and to the cabin that he had built. Much to Catherine's amazement, when she got to the land that her son had purchased, she realized it was the exact location where she was held captive by the Shawnee Indians. She showed her son and her daughter, or her daughter-in-law, and her grandchildren the place where her little log hut stood, her little wooden hut made out of branches where it stood. And she told her son, she said, when I die, I want to be buried right here where my log or my wooden hut was, where my house was. This was my home for 5 years. And the story goes that Catherine, she was left-handed, and she had a sickle, and she would keep that area cleaned out, and she would keep all the brush cut down, and she kept that one little spot cleaned out because when she died, she wanted to be buried there. And so, such an amazing story. And I just don't know how anything like this could happen, but it did happen. Catherine is known to be the first white woman in Ohio, and probably, and for sure, the first white woman who came to Ohio who actually left seed or left descendants of her where she had been held captive by Indians. And today there are several families here in Ross County that owe their heritage to Catherine. They are descendants of Catherine. There's the Emmel family, the Jones family. I think there were some Davises and the Wiggets, and probably many, many, many others. But we're going to show you the spot where Catherine is buried. Right there is Catherine's headstone. Early in the 1900s, about somewhere around 1915, Catherine's descendants, they had kept her grave tended, and they erected this monument on this site, and it tells the story of their great grandmother many greats ago. I work with two individuals here in Ross County, and I work for ODOT, and two of my co-workers are descendants of Catherine Gouger, and I should say her name was Catherine Gouger Goodman, because she was married to George Goodman, and her children were Goodman. And Catherine lived an amazing life. She is a definitely an example of toughness and endurance and a pioneer spirit. So when you get thinking sometimes that life is hard for you, you remember Catherine Gouger. She was quite a lady. When John Goodman first came to Ross County, he built a log cabin, and later that log cabin morphed into a larger structure and a larger two-story log home. And underneath the center section of this home is the original cabin that John Goodman built, and that Catherine Gouger Goodman lived in with her son and his family. And I've talked to the owner of this house, and she's given me quite a bit of information, and how Catherine used to go down to the Scioto riverbank, and she would sit down there with her children, her grandchildren, and spend time with them down there. And she seems to think that Catherine's ghost still lingers there. And she says there's cold places down there and along that area, and so she believes that Catherine is there. I have said before, I've never saw ghosts. I've never had that experience. I don't discount other people's experiences, and I will not, I will not dispute what they say they see and they feel. It's something I just don't understand. So maybe Catherine still lingers here, and she wanders this property. Her grave is only just right up there across the field, about a football field length away from where I'm standing now. And as you can see on the sign here, it says, under this modern home is the original cabin, which was erected by John Goodman and Helper Huns in 1798. With preemption rights then deeded in 1808, the Goodman Tavern Wayside Inn from 1807 to 1819, tenured by Mr. Goodman during the Methodist fervor years, with guests such as President James Monroe and General Hall. Also, the last resting place of Catherine Gouger Goodman. Her detailed monument is north of this rock, opposite side of Orr Road. In 1830, the land was distributed to heirs. In 1965, 50 acres was purchased by Stanley and Nola Davis, and now their heirs. It may be out of the Goodman family, but the love of the land and what made it are still carried on. So Catherine Gouger Goodman lived here in her elderly years. Catherine died in 1801, and she roamed this area. She roamed the spot down there along the side of the river, and she sat with the children down there. And Mrs. Davis, that owns this house, seems to think that Catherine isn't buried by the monument. She thinks Catherine is buried by the river because she can feel a presence down there. So whatever the case is, Catherine is close. And she is a person that we need to remember.